Good afternoon. My name is Savani. I'm Head of Innovation and Engineering at ADS. I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon to the Aerospace Growth Partnership webinar focusing on aviation sustainability and market-based measures. So we all know environmental sustainability, decarbonisation, and aviation's response to the climate change challenge is the driving force for our industry. Over the past few years, the industry has worked hard to improve its environmental performance and actually decoupled the growth of the sector from the commensurate growth in its emissions. But we know that's not enough. We need to move to a new path away from the incremental improvements and towards that path of net zero 2050. Every decarbonisation roadmap that we see today, heading towards net zero 2050, has a range of measures in terms of its implementation. And that broadly fits into a few categories. Improvements from directly within the sector, such as low carbon aircraft technology, improvements in partnership with enabling sectors, such as the development and commercialization of low carbon fuels, and then a range of measures around removing the residual carbon from those two measures, so-called out-of-sector mechanisms, such as offsetting, collectively known as market-based measures. We know that none of these alone will get us towards net zero 2050, and we know it will be the right mix of these solutions that will enable us to get onto that trajectory. Other AGP and wider sessions during the Connect event will discuss some of those other areas in more detail, so I welcome you to join those sessions. So specifically in this session, we want to shine a light on the market-based measures approach. We want to talk about broadly in terms of what market-based measures are and how they can help. Specifically, we'll talk about a fleet renewal scheme that is being proposed, so-called scrappage scheme, and that will be followed by a Q&A session where we can discuss some of these aspects in greater detail. So without much further ado, I want to introduce our panel. That consists of Shama, Senior Associate in the Global Fiscal Policy Team at PWC, Robert Thomson, Partner at Roland Berger, the Strategy Consultants, Carrie Harris, Group Sustainability Manager at International Airlines Group, and Rachael Everard, Head of Sustainability at Rolls-Royce. So first up is Shama, who can talk us through the work that PwC have been doing on market-based measures.
Many thanks for the introduction, Samir. I appreciate that. I think this is a really important opportunity to discuss sustainability in aviation and explore the policy options available to incentivize key environmental priorities, such as decarbonization and net zero, as you mentioned. In this presentation today, I'll have four aims. First aim is to briefly introduce myself, my team at PwC, and aim to contextualize our involvement in this topic. The second aim would be to explore the role of fiscal policy as one of the levers in pursuing decarbonization. The third will be to describe my team's approach in analyzing the issue, and finally reflect on key drivers of decarbonization across the supply chain. So our partner Amal leads our team. She has over 20 years of experience working directly with governments, international institutions to develop innovative solutions on tax and fiscal policy. For my part, I joined the team 7 months ago, and I previously worked at the U.S. Department of State, where I worked at the U.S. mission to the European Union, and in Washington, D.C., and also informally as an advisor working with Adam Holloway with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drones. In terms of what we do at GFP and PwC, we do three things. Well, first is that we specialize in designing and guiding the implementation of public policy, including environmental policy and net zero. We also facilitate our clients' transitions into the green economy by balancing competitiveness and innovation with environmental protection. And lastly, we help our clients to understand which issues will have the greatest impact on their business, to help them form a coherent strategy to address them and support them through its implementation. So if we move on to the next slide, concerns the role of fiscal policy in decarbonization. And so there are two basic elements here. If you look at the objectives, our objectives are to, in this research, to do two things. One is to bridge the current knowledge gap by engaging with the aviation industry representatives to understand the role that the full array of fiscal policy tools can play in achieving decarbonization in the industry. And this would include market-based measures, tax policy, other fiscal instruments such as government spending and R&D subsidies, and the indirect impacts of fiscal policy on private initiatives. And then the second thing would be to understand how the impacts generated flow across the value chain. And so that leads us to the next slide, where we address how we approach decarbonizing the aviation industry. And so if you look at this slide, in terms of our approach, the two primary data sources in this study consist of the literature review, which we've done, and the consultation, which is ongoing with industry stakeholders. And then the second component that we think in terms of trying to understand this conceptually, we think that an aircraft's journey across its very long period of service and life cycle would be a helpful way to frame the interplay between market-based measures, taxes, and other fiscal measures in aviation. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll address each of those phases and how they correspond with those fiscal policy measures in turn. So on this slide, we go through the decarbonization drivers across the value chain. So in this slide, we illustrate the different policy levers that can be considered across the aircraft's life cycle and that are often used in conjunction. These examples illustrate the benefits a multifaceted approach to policymaking can have and how it can be employed to incentivize the different parts of the supply chain that are involved in an aircraft's life cycle. So we're not going to go through all of the different examples, but I've noted at least 3 examples for each phase. But at least from phase 1 at the R&D phase, an important example that we thought mention is the first one about sustainable aviation fuel subsidies. According to the UK government's aerospace sector deal that was published this year, over £500 million has been pledged by the government to support cleaner, quieter civil aviation aircraft. If we move on to phase 2, with regard to manufacturing and sales, an example of this would be the implementation of market-based measures where consumer demand has incentivized companies to produce low-carbon aircraft and sustainable aviation fuels. So this is also reported by McKinsey in a study that they published, I think in the past month or so this year. And this also relates to the market-based measures component that we discussed previously. In phase 3, on the service and operations side, an example of this would be the carbon tax. So environmental taxes levied on kerosene, jet fuels, have been used to incentivize the use of alternatives like low carbon aircraft or sustainable aviation fuels. And the same study from McKinsey highlights how Canada has implemented a carbon tax to that effect. And then the final phase is in retirement. And this is an example of, for example, how industry has used its own initiative to promote sustainable aviation. And an example of this would be recycling parts and components. An IATA report in 2020 this year also noted that the vast majority, between 80 and 90% of the aircraft parts and components can be recycled and reused, which has the effect of reducing the industry's overall carbon footprint. And so the last example that we cite in phase 4 in retirement is the aircraft scrappage scheme. But I know Roland Berger is going to be talking about this in greater detail. But what we have found so far in our research is that the industry is encouraging the UK government to implement an air scrappage scheme that can phase in environmentally friendly aircraft wings and engine components and phase out the less environmentally friendly, less efficient options. So with that, I'm very happy to hand this over to Robert to expand a bit more on the aircraft scrappage scheme.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here to represent the Roland Berger Global Aerospace and Defence practice, which is the preeminent practice in aerospace and defence worldwide, with centres in North America, Europe, Middle East, India, and China. We're also very active in sustainability at the moment, and we'll be publishing our roadmap to True Zero at Farnborough Connect. So that's another session that people can join to find out more about sustainability if they would like to do so. I'm going to talk a bit about the proposed aircraft scrappage scheme. And I should begin by just thanking all of the companies that have taken part and contributed to our research so far. Those include Airbus, EasyJet, GKN, IAG, Meggitt, Rolls-Royce, Spirit, and also Unite the Union. If we move on to our first page, up front, I just wanted to be clear that the aerospace industry is a major contributor to the UK economy, and it's one of the worst hit by the COVID-19 crisis. Aerospace generates over 30 billion in exports every year, supports over 100,000 jobs directly, and 90% of those jobs are located outside London and the South East. So within the UK, it covers all areas of the UK, including Northern Ireland. That said, the industry's been hit very hard by COVID-19. We're expecting to see something of the order of a 50% drop in new aircraft deliveries over the next 3 years, and also up to a 70% drop in spending on maintenance, repair and overhaul by airlines. And that's particularly significant given that MRO spending and the spare parts associated with that are a major profit driver for many companies in the aerospace industry. To offset that, on the next page, we've then described what an aircraft scheme could look like and how it could help to sustain the UK aerospace sector. On the left-hand side, our initial design of the scheme is that it would incentivize UK domiciled airlines to refresh current aging aircraft. And by that we mean that all older generation aircraft would be replaced and all current generation aircraft over 25 years old would be replaced. And in both categories, those aircraft would be replaced by new generation aircraft. For the aircraft enthusiast amongst you, by older generation aircraft, we mean aircraft like the 737 Classic. Current generation aircraft, we would mean the 737NG and the Airbus CEO. And for new generation aircraft, we would mean aircraft like the Airbus A320neo, 787 and the A350. If we were to adopt a policy of going down this route, we would generate demand for an extra 90 new aircraft, which would represent 13% of the UK's pre-COVID operational fleet, and therefore quite a stimulus to new aircraft building. In addition to that stimulus to new aircraft building and the supply chain associated with it, it would also offer a benefit to the UK environment. Overall, we calculate that making this change, putting these 90 new aircraft into service, retiring 90 corresponding old aircraft, would reduce CO2 emissions by approximately 4%. So we can see an environmental benefit through this scheme, but predominantly the scheme is about supporting aircraft manufacturing and the supply chain, and the environmental benefits are a secondary positive from this type of scheme. Having said that, if we go forward to the next page, we also need to consider quite carefully a number of factors in order to make sure that such a scheme is fair and successful. First of all, on the top left-hand side of this page, compensation would have to be paid to suppliers that have a business model dependent on the aerospace aftermarket. Around about 20% of UK aerospace jobs are directly associated with the maintenance, repair and overhaul of old aircraft. And companies such as engine suppliers, many system suppliers, and organisations doing maintenance, repair and overhaul work are all dependent on these old aircraft for their business and also a major source of profit. So these companies would need to be compensated if a whole load of old aircraft were retired. In the middle of the page, I've discussed the considerations for the environment and the moderate benefit we would see. Costs of the environmental benefits we calculate are in the range of £100 to £200 per tonne of CO2. That compares to around about 30 euros for an allowance under the European Emissions Trading Scheme at the moment, and around about £3 per tonne for an offset, a decent quality carbon offset. So the costs in terms of environmental benefits are relatively high. That said, they are similar sort of order of magnitude to the cash for clunkers scheme, which is discussed in the automotive sector. And then the final consideration on this page is that we have to be certain that airlines which have already invested in efficient fleets of low emissions aircraft are not disadvantaged by the fact that they've done this and they've already invested in order to have a young, fuel efficient and low emission fleet, and that the competitive balance within the market is not upset as a result of that. So on my final slide, if I just summarize our views at the moment, an aircraft scrappage scheme would benefit the industry, provided the key challenges which I've outlined can be resolved. The aerospace industry, as I said, is a major contributor to the British economy. The aircraft scrappage scheme would help to provide support to the UK aerospace supply chain and mitigate the effects of the current downturn. But we have to make sure that such a scheme compensates the suppliers of engines, systems, and maintenance, repair and overhaul services. And we also think that this aircraft scrappage scheme in and of itself is insufficient to revitalise the whole UK aerospace industry, and further measures should be considered, particularly in the light of the support that other governments are giving to their aerospace industries worldwide, and the need for the UK to retain this critical industry within the UK's broader economy. That's a summary of our work to date on the scrappage scheme, and then I'll hand back to Samir to introduce the next participant.
Thank you very much, Robert and Shama. Really fascinating insights, and we look forward to the final reports from both of your studies to be able to be circulated with industry and get some broader ranging feedback on that work. So we'll go to each of our two additional panelists in turn to provide some initial responses and overviews from their perspectives before we move on to questions and answers. So if I'd like to hand over to Carrie in the first instance. Carrie.
Thank you, Samir. Hi everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to join this discussion today. So as Samir said at the outset, I am Group Sustainability Manager for International Airlines Group. So our group comprises British Airways, Iberia, Vueling, Aer Lingus and Level. And at the moment our fleet of aircraft is almost 600 aircraft, and last year we carried about 117 million passengers. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of scale of our operation. So for IAG, we've always been committed and got a long track record of commitment to addressing our environmental impacts, and in particular kind of leading action to address climate impacts. But last year we really stepped up our ambition on that. So in October last year, we launched our Flight Path Net Zero climate strategy, setting out for the first time for the airline industry globally our ambition to be at net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And we were delighted when this year Sustainable Aviation, the UK coalition group, jointly announced a commitment for the whole of the UK aviation industry to the same target of net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So I want to give a very brief overview now of our Flight Path Net Zero strategy and set the kind of frame the discussion of what we're about to discuss on market-based measures. So you can see here our Flight Path Net Zero announced 3 targets over the short, medium and long term to 2050. And we felt it was very important to set out interim milestones on that path to demonstrate how we're going to get to that goal, as well as committing to the target in the first place. And we also felt it was very important to demonstrate that we're taking action now, not just waiting for the technology solutions to arrive in future, but actually taking action now where we can to address our climate impacts now. So British Airways is offering carbon neutral flights for all its UK domestic flights from this year onwards. And we also announced British Airways investment of $400 million in sustainable aviation fuels over the next 20 years, beginning with the investment in the Velocys plant with Shell in the north of England, which just recently got planning permission. So that will begin producing fuel from 2025, and taking waste that would otherwise have gone to landfill and converting that into jet fuel. So next slide, please. So this is our decarbonisation roadmap. It's very similar to the UK Sustainable Aviation Roadmap, but we've tailored it for IAG's business. And I just want to highlight some of the key things. Very much as Samir said at the outset, we absolutely agree that there's no silver bullet here to decarbonise aviation. Action is needed across every part of the sector, and multiple different solutions will be required within each element of that too. But for us, we're committed to the fact that in-sector emissions reductions has to be our priority. So that is our first step, is taking action to reduce our own emissions. Initially, that will be through operational efficiency and focus on how we're operating our fleet that we have now, and bringing in new modern aircraft like the ones that Robert mentioned, that even already are delivering fuel efficiency benefits of between 20 to 40% compared to the aircraft that they're replacing. And over time, that will evolve to future aircraft types, innovative technology like electric, hydrogen, and other potential technology solutions that are coming on stream. So that basically addresses that dark green wedge that you see there that we believe will deliver around 40% of our CO2 reduction by 2050. Then there's the additional wedge there that's the kind of dotted wedge, and that's what we believe is quite a conservative assessment of potential for sustainable aviation fuel. As I said, that can have life cycle emissions reductions of up to 70%, and with carbon capture technology added, that could be 100% life cycle emission reductions. So together, these steps about new aircraft, operational efficiency, and sustainable fuels could take us 60% of the way there, 60% of in-sector emissions reductions, which leaves a gap then, so around 40% potentially, that has to be addressed through other measures. And this is where market-based measures come in, giving aviation the opportunity to tackle climate impacts now while we wait for the technological solutions to scale up and come to the market so that we can add these to in-sector reductions in future. And so this chart just shows some of these measures. So for example, CORSIA, the Global Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, which is due to begin from next year and has been 10 years in the making, led by ICAO. That is the first global sectoral CO2 trading scheme for aviation. And it means that aviation will be able to mitigate 2.5 billion tonnes of CO2 in the next 15 years, representing $40 billion of investment in low carbon initiatives. And we've also got the EU ETS for domestic and intra-EU flights, and then the options with voluntary offsets and over time carbon capture technology and nature-based carbon removals, such as afforestation and blue carbon solutions. So just to frame the discussion that's coming next, I think we need to recognise that the UK government has been incredibly supportive to our sector in terms of already offering incentives and support to help us begin the innovation for sustainable aviation fuels. So through the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation and the F4C initiatives, which have given millions of funding to help support initial plants. But we will need further policy support and fiscal support to help scale up these innovative technologies. And so I look forward to discussing those as we go forward. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that, Carrie. Pass over to Rachael now.
Well, thank you firstly for having me join the panel today. I'm Rachael Everard, Head of Sustainability at Rolls-Royce. I think this is a really important topic. It's something that the industry has to come to grips with. As Carrie has said, market-based measures are going to play an increasingly important role in setting out aviation's future pathway towards net zero emissions, carbon emissions. From Rolls-Royce's perspective, we are already, like many others, part of the ACARI Flight Path 2050 and ATAG decarbonisation targets. we have, similar to IAG, set our own target to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I'm particularly proud, actually, that Rolls-Royce did make that announcement and join the UK Race to Zero campaign last month, in fact in June, at the kind of worst possible timing in terms of the impact of COVID on the industry, as well as Rolls-Royce specifically. And I think that shows really the direction of travel that we're in as an industry. I think when we step back and we consider the crux of the challenge here, it really is, how do we ensure that aviation can be compatible with a net zero carbon future in a way that doesn't overtly impact the levels of connectivity, comfort and affordability that is associated with air travel today. And I think it's clear when you consider it from that angle that market-based measures are going to have a role to play in making sure that we can make a just and smooth transition to a low carbon economy in a way that can stabilise the market and enable the changes necessary. From Rolls-Royce's perspective, we are a technology company and we are always going to pursue technological solutions to this challenge. And I think that's very clear from the strategy that Rolls-Royce has set out in terms of pursuing increasing engine efficiencies, scaling up the availability of lower carbon alternative fuels, and also pursuing novel disruptive technologies such as the electrification of flight. But it's very clear that reaching net zero carbon by 2050 is going to require a systems level transformation and universal change across our entire sector. And I think when we look at the technology shifts that are going to be necessary, like I said, I think market-based measures will have a really important role to play. And I think it's about making sure that we are using them as a lever, but a transparent lever, and we're using them in a way that avoids kind of carbon leakage into other sectors or public dismissal. And that's really important. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and understanding kind of what market-based measures can unlock for the industry.
Thank you, Rachael and Carrie, for those overviews. So we've got a range of questions that have come in, and I'll try to keep us on track and get through as many of them as possible. So the first one's really broad, and I'll probably tee up Carrie from IAG for initial response, but invite other panelists to come in. Market-based measures, offset schemes are often misinterpreted as greenwashing or pay-to-pollute schemes. At a time where public scrutiny in aviation is at an all-time high, how can we make sure collectively as an industry that the flying public is confident in the credentials of these schemes?
Yeah, Samir, it's a really important point, and there is so much scepticism and a lack of understanding really about how offsetting in particular can work for aviation and for other sectors as well. And so I think it's something that ICAO has been incredibly focused on right from the outset in establishing the design of CORSIA. So a huge amount of work has been done to bring expert stakeholders together to design very robust sustainability criteria, governance criteria, and monitoring, reporting, and verification aspects to make sure that this scheme is rigorous and to make sure that the emissions reductions that occur are additional. As Rachael said, there's no carbon leakage, that they're permanent, and that they're verifiable and traceable. So, bringing together states, governments, industry representatives, and NGOs has helped make sure that we've been able to learn then from other systems that are already in place. So the California ETS scheme, the EU ETS scheme, the UN CDM, all of those have given food to learn for ICAO. And so hopefully CORSIA has got the benefit of all those, and we're putting in place the best possible structure to make sure that we minimise any risk of wrongdoing. But I think we need to recognise that where there's money transfer, there is a risk of fraud at times. And so I think for airlines, obviously, we want to avoid that as much as possible. And I'm quite sure that every airline who needs to comply with CORSIA will be looking to buy the highest quality, verified carbon reductions to make sure that they're avoiding any risk of that.
Thank you, Carrie. I wonder if any of the panelists want to respond to that question around public perception and confidence in some of these schemes to make sure we aren't seen as this isn't seen as an easy get-out clause.
Yeah, I think Carrie's point around transparency and the use of high-quality offsets is really important. I think it's also about how we position offsetting. It's not a get-out clause. as you've just said, it's really around an interim solution while the other options available kind of catch up at scale. I think that's really important. And I think kind of approaching offsetting in that way as almost the kind of only viable when other options have been kind of fully exhausted, whether that's avoiding, reducing or substituting emissions. That's how we should be approaching offsets. It is that interim solution to a long-term challenge.
That's a really good point, Rachael, and I really like some of the work that EasyJet have done in terms of the package measures, for example. And I know Robert may be able to comment more specifically around the way they've described offsetting and market-based measures as a temporary solution while they develop the technology and fully renew their fleets. Robert, did you want to come in there?
Yes, certainly. I would agree with what Rachael said about offsetting being an interim measure. If you look at the challenge that aviation has today, there is no technical solution to emissions other than stopping flying, which we as an industry clearly don't want. And so the only solution available today is offsetting. I think that in some quarters, offsetting got a bad press in the early days when schemes were not very well defined or not very well regulated. But if you look nowadays at offset schemes, particularly those which are gold standard or VCS, there are a set of very clear criteria which each individual offsetting project is scored against in order to make sure that it gets these a gold standard stamp or a VCS stamp. And those criteria, as Carrie indicated, are around additionality, being measurable, independently audited, being permanent, no double counting, no adverse impact on local communities. And for those sorts of schemes, which then subdivide into reforestation or renewable energy, or even schemes which do more social good, I think there is a lot of evidence that offset is a credible and a good thing to do. And we can use this as an interim solution whilst we wait for sustainable fuels or electrical propulsion or even hydrogen to become available. So we should view it as an interim solution, but it's the only one we have today.
Understood, Robert. I guess if I kind of pick up on a related question, you know, the EU ETS allowances are not currently accepted under CORSIA, and international offset credits are going to be stopped being accepted under ETS as of January 2021. Does that signal a divergence? Are we ready to kind of decide whether something like an ETS scheme is better than an offsetting scheme like CORSIA? And I'm wondering if any of the research that PWC have done have pointed towards which of those are going to be more successful, or will there always be a need for a mix of schemes? Shama, I wonder if you can come in terms of the balance between those schemes.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Just sort of in full disclosure, we're sort of in the phase where we're sort of gathering data from our interviewees, and some of the interviewees I think actually happen to overlap with those that have been mentioned before, including Rolls-Royce and Airbus and others. But right now, we're at this stage of the process, we're interested in trying to survey all of the different fiscal instruments, including market-based measures and ETS included among market-based measures, to see if in fact a combination would be best, or if one particular measure has worked more effectively than others. But I think what our aim is to do is to, in the way that we laid out, to overview the broad menu of different measures that are available, and to decide and to sort of come up and synthesize the kind of specific measures that might be most effective in combination with each other. So we've talked about others, and I've also mentioned the fact that there is the emissions trading scheme, and there are other there are other mechanisms that are involved. Among some of our interviewees, they've also echoed some of the public concerns about these market-based measures as greenwashing, and have highlighted among some industry have highlighted the need for potentially more stringent measures like mandates. But I think at this stage, we would just want to kind of be able to collate all of the different information that we would get from our industry participants, and then come up with kind of the recommendations along these lines. But looking at it, I think it's important to have that broad perspective, and then be able to decide which measures taken in combination can be most effective.
Understood. Carrie, an airline group like yours is obviously operating in territories where different schemes are being used. I wonder if you've got a view on the differences between ETS and CORSIA, and whether one is better or it's healthy to have that mix.
Sure. I mean, I think ideally for us, it would be much better if we had one global scheme, a global scheme to address a global problem of climate for aviation. But I think we need to recognise the different maturity of the political ambition within Europe versus at the global scale. And so a pragmatic solution has to be that the two schemes, CORSIA and the EU ETS, will run alongside each other at least for the next few years, we anticipate. I think the ETS, the EU ETS, is a very robust scheme, the cap and trade scheme, and it's meant that since airlines have been involved in that since 2012, airlines have been able to collectively purchase allowances that have enabled 120 million tonnes of CO2 reductions through the scheme. So it's incredibly effective. But CORSIA has the opportunity to be just as effective, as I said, and we see it, a priority now is to get CORSIA in, to get it working, and then through the 3-year review mechanism that's built into CORSIA, there's an opportunity over time to increase the level of ambition within CORSIA and to move beyond using that as an instrument for carbon neutral growth. So in time, that could be the instrument or an evolution of it that could help us get to the industry's 50% net reduction by 2050, or even further towards the kind of ambition that we've set out in the UK. I think it's worth saying as well that, offsetting is potentially, it's such a positive opportunity for the world, because it's this opportunity to get flows of money going from polluters. So it's the polluter pays principle being applied, and to get these flows of money going into areas where they're vitally needed. I think the IPCC report said that up to 1/3 of the climate challenge could be addressed through measures such as protecting existing forests and reforestation. And that's exactly where offsetting such as CORSIA scheme could really enable those flows of money to where they're absolutely needed to protect biodiversity and to help economies in developing countries. So I see them as a really incredibly positive opportunity for the world.
Thank you. Changing track ever so slightly back to this. Sorry, go on, Robert.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, of course.
I was going to say, from my perspective, the difference between ETS and CORSIA, as well as the different designs of the scheme, and as Carrie said, one's cap and trade and one is offset. One of the big differences is baseline, in that ETS has applied to aviation since 2012, but the baseline is an average of 2004 to 6 emissions. CORSIA was originally planned to have a baseline as the average of 2019 and 2020. Obviously, what's happened with COVID is going to upset that and require a reset of the baseline for CORSIA. But given that CORSIA is going to be set at a level something like 2019-2020 versus ETS being set at 2004 to 6, CORSIA gives a lot of relief to airlines compared to ETS, and it is a lot cheaper to implement compared to ETS. So if we do go down a CORSIA route, it will undoubtedly be good for airlines, and I'm sure that they'll pass on the saved costs to the travelling public as well, so it'll be good to the public too. But it does slightly reduce the pressure on airlines and therefore the industry in terms of improving the emissions of individual aircraft. So I think we just need to be careful to think about how the two schemes are standardized. The worst of all world would be if companies end up paying twice, and I guess that Carrie may already be feeling that a little bit. with BA offsetting domestic UK, because under ETS they would also be paying for EU allowances there. So as a result of the voluntary decision by BA to offset, they end up paying both for offset and for ETS. And clearly we don't want a global system that results in airlines paying twice to offset or to cover their sustainability requirements.
Yeah, so just to come in on that, and for clarity, we don't pay twice. So we've been very clear with our regulator that we pay for the offset for the residual that's not already paid, because we absolutely agree that each ton of CO2 should be regulated once and not multiple times.
Right.
And so that's something that we're still working with governments to help see how CORSIA and the EU ETS and UK ETS, for that matter, when it comes in, how these are all going to align in the future.
Thank you both. Just switching track over to the specifics of a renewal scheme or a so-called scrappage scheme. If the UK government were to back a renewal scheme, there would have to be something in there that would both make sure that that UK governmental investment was creating UK benefit and that investment was finding its way back into the UK supply chain. But at the same time, we wouldn't want a scheme like that to spark some kind of mini trade war where local schemes are popping up all over the world, creating a sense of protectionism. So, you know, Robert very specifically mentioned that a renewal scheme may have some winners and losers, depending on the timings and the mechanisms that were kind of in place. Robert, I wonder if you've got any ideas of how we make sure, if there is such a scheme that's brought forward, it delivers the right kind of behaviours.
Yes, I think it's quite a complicated question, and I'll split it down into three different points. First of all, if we do have a scrappage scheme, I think it has to be incumbent on those who are purchasing aircraft that they buy aircraft with a good proportion of UK content. So, for instance, if we were to take out of service an old aircraft and we were to buy, let's say, a Boeing 787 with GE engines on it, then we would end up in a situation where we would end up subsidizing somebody else's supply chain and somebody else's industry. And that may not be the best use of UK taxpayers' money to do that. So we need to look at that carefully. Secondly, if it is UK government taxpayers' money which is being given to support the industry, I think aerospace companies need to make commitments to support UK domestic presence and UK jobs as well. So we shouldn't be handing out taxpayers' money for free, but we should be asking for commitments over future R&D in the industry being done in the UK and future manufacturing being done in the UK as well. And then the third element, which I would say, is that we need to be careful about leakage as well. Something like 50% of the narrow-body fleet worldwide is leased. And if we end up in a situation where we are indirectly subsidizing leasing companies, many of which will not be based in the UK for tax reasons, again, we don't want to see a leakage of UK taxpayer money into offshore jurisdictions where tax rates may be lower, and thereby, again, disadvantaging the UK taxpayer. So these schemes, although in principle they're quite simple, and you can see the clear benefit to aircraft manufacturing and the supply chain, there are a number of side effects which need to be considered very carefully before they can go ahead.
Thanks, Robert. And just thinking about some of those side effects, I'd like to bring Rachael in. You know, Robert clearly mentioned in his presentation that there could be UK engine manufacturers who are particularly exposed to the kind of aftermarket business model. I wonder who that could be, and how you feel about what this kind of scheme could bring and how it could be implemented in a way that would have the right industrial impacts, particularly for you and your supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Rolls-Royce as a whole, we're remaining curious about the potentials of the scheme. That said, I think this has been positioned, or originally positioned at least, as a green initiative and a decarbonisation initiative. Our in-house analysis kind of is pointing to that being pretty negligible at this point, and I think Robert said actually that the environmental benefits could be considered secondary at best. We do believe, like I said, as a technology company at the start, that there are other investments that could drive a much more significant carbon saving, particularly over the longer term, for the billions of pounds that are being discussed for this scheme in particular, whether that's new technologies, furthering R&D, or accelerating the use of alternative fuels. And when we consider that this is put forward as a public taxpayer money scheme, I think there is much more efficient ways that we could support the industry and support the industry's decarbonisation goals with the more efficient use of that money. Specifically on the kind of impact on engine manufacturers, like you said, our business model is built around aftermarket in particular, and there is, you know, a clear sign that this could have a significantly adverse impact upon the early retirement of aircraft being brought forward. But I think more importantly, and from a decarbonisation perspective, we have to consider the potential impact on our ability to invest in the technological solutions that can address the climate challenge kind of head on. And while we do remain curious and we do want to work with customers and governments and industry to understand the potentials of the scheme and understand how it could work for our customers and for us as well, I think most importantly we have to understand whether it delivers the necessary carbon benefits that we're all seeking.
Understood. And a question for Carrie again, given, you know, if there is a push towards some kind of fleet renewal stimulus, you'll see different mechanisms popping up in different territories. I'm wondering if you've got a view as an airline as to what you would like to see from a scheme like this.
Similar to Rachel, I mean, I won't comment on the scheme design because my expertise is in the environmental area, and as we've heard, the environmental opportunities with this are secondary to the potential to support the kind of manufacturing aspects and the jobs aspects. So yeah, I won't comment on that aspect.
Thank you. So coming back to kind of broadly the market-based measures and particularly emissions trading and offsetting schemes, they work quite differently in terms of a mechanism. Does that mean we're likely to see divergence between these schemes as we go forward? Or is it just too early in the cycle to understand where this is going to lie? Carrie, you very clearly said it would be ideal to have a universal global scheme that everyone was buying into. But at the moment, certainly the comments I've had from Shama seem to be it's a little bit early to tell which ones are going to win out. I'm kind of half fearing that we end up with a plethora of schemes which are really complicated, you know, creates burdens on industry, but also doesn't bring that public confidence in schemes as they mature and bring forward. Wonder if any of the panelists want to come in on that.
Yeah, I guess just to reiterate the point really, as Carrie was saying, aviation is by its very nature a global sector, and we shouldn't be we're not looking for a divergence in policy or approach here. I think at the same time, as someone said right at the start, there's no silver bullet for decarbonising aviation, and we do have to consider what will be a raft of different technologies and different measures in order to achieve that. I think when we look at market-based measures, we have to approach them from a kind of, where is the biggest carbon saving to be made? You know, what's going to abate CO2 in an affordable and effective way? And what are the measures that can bring about the changes that we do need to decarbonise at scale and for the long term? I think that's really important. And I think the challenge for us all is to make sure that this continues to be a technology challenge rather than an accountancy or reporting challenge.
No, understood. As we kind of huddle towards the end of the session, time flies when you're having fun. I'm wondering if each of the panelists can just give us a 1 minute pitch or a summary from their perspective, and then I'll wrap up with a few points of my own. If I start as I can see you on the screen, Robert.
Yes, well, I would just summarize by saying that sustainability is, for me, one of the defining challenges for the aviation and aerospace industries. Obviously, what's happened in the last 3 months has put front and center a slightly different challenge in revitalizing the industry. But from a 3 to 5 year perspective, we still think sustainability is the defining challenge for the industry. We think that the way forward is through a range of different measures. There are a set of different technologies. First of all, we see sustainable fuels as being the earliest technology which will be available, questions about the cost of sustainable fuels and the availability of scale, but we think that's the first which comes available. There will then be potentially hybrid electric aircraft, battery electric aircraft, and even hydrogen, though we're somewhat skeptical about hydrogen, despite some recent reports which have pushed the benefits pretty hard, but without recognizing some of the shortcomings of hydrogen around volumetric density and aviation-induced cloudiness and so on. So we think that sustainability is the defining challenge. We think that technology is the answer. And I think that market-based measures can help push us in the right direction, but we need to make certain that we're not taking too much money out of the industry by taxing it heavily. And that any money which is taken out of the industry through things like ETS is recycled back to the industry in the form of R&D or R&T money, so that we can actually get ahead and invest in these new technologies, which will help solve the underlying problem.
Thank you, Robert. I'll ask Carrie to come in next, and apologies whoever ends up as last, because there's always difficult to wrap up when you've got so many good views coming in. Carrie.
Yeah, so I agree, absolutely. Sustainability, in particular the climate challenge, is the defining challenge for aviation at the moment. But what I'm really encouraged by is the fact that the focus has not wavered at all throughout the pandemic. In fact, I think if anything, it's helped accelerate focus. And all the talk of the green recovery from the pandemic is incredibly encouraging. And I think we're at a very exciting time where we're just seeing this kind of nascent buds of this new green economy. And happily, aviation is right in there, because we've got CORSIA, we've got this market-based mechanism that's up and running incredibly at a global scale, agreed by 192 nations globally. So we're in a very great place. And I just say that the opportunity to bring forward, funding and investment to help decarbonise aviation, but at the same time to enable growing new industries, jobs in green economy, is very exciting. And that's a real opportunity for sustainable aviation fuels, but also for future aircraft and technology solutions as well.
Thank you, Carrie. Shama, any closing remarks from yourself?
So yeah, I think I would echo what all the other panelists have said. In particular, I think, for example, Robert mentioned that this is something that we have to view cyclically. So looking at market-based measures like EU ETS or CORSIA in conjunction with other measures, some of which we discussed, including fiscal instruments, tax policy, and industry initiatives, is tremendously important at arriving at the most effective decarbonization solution over the long term. So taken together, I think these measures are promising, and there has been already clearly a significant interest among industry to advance this agenda despite COVID and present circumstances. So I think I would just strike a note of optimism about both the commitments in concrete terms, but also in terms of conceptually toward reaching decarbonization in a way that is both meaningful, but also in a way that that can address public concerns in the long term about decarbonization.
Thank you, Shama. And last but not least, Rachael.
Yeah, I get to go last, so I guess.
Oh, I've got to go last, so yeah, imagine me.
First thing is just say, yeah, I echo absolutely what all of the panelists have just said. I think we are in the midst of a unique opportunity for aviation at this point, as Farnborough is held virtually through COVID, to actually set course for history in terms of looking at the green recovery, not just of the economy, but of our sector specifically. And I think that is an exciting, if daunting, challenge. I think, as I said before, I think there are technological solutions to this challenge, and I do think that R&D should and can lead the way out of at least for aviation's net zero carbon future. I think that is a pathway that we are forging ahead with. But I do think market-based measures have a role to play in helping to make that happen. As Robert said, measures that can keep funding within the sector and can help to pursue these technologies is really important, and scaling up of alternative fuels in particular, the use of mandates and things like that to help to stimulate that market will be vital to making sure that that happens, because I think it's within all of our best interests, not just within the aviation sector itself, but the whole economy and the wider society to continue flying in particular, but to find a way to do that that is compatible with the carbon commitments that we have made here in the UK. I think that's really important. But this will require whole systems level transformation, and that requires a raft of different measures, one of which is going to be market-based measures.
No, thank you, and that's a neat segue. So it's clear that the panel very much agrees that market-based measures are a vital part of the mix to decarbonise, but perhaps there's more work to be done in terms of communicating some of those benefits, just in terms of how robust some of those mechanisms are and how they are being effective and working. So clearly transparency is key about how those mechanisms work alongside ensuring that they remain robust. I think we'll also agree that some of those mechanisms are a temporary measure, while we essentially give ourselves the time to develop some of those advanced technologies, scale up sustainable aviation fuels to make sure we are really having the in-sector impacts to decarbonise. While we do that, MBMs are going to be a really important part of the mix to make sure the way we're flying today in the here and now is sustainable. So just a final word in terms of the kinds of mechanisms we have at our disposal, and we heard about a few of them today. It's probably too early at this stage to see what mix of those mechanisms is going to bring us the best balance, but there is obviously a lot of work going on, some of these mechanisms being implemented. So over the coming years, we will be able to see which schemes are successful, which ones need to be tapered up or tapered down, depending on how the technology investment and the fuel scale up goes. So thank you very much for taking part in this panel. Really interesting, really fascinating. And again, I invite everybody who is listening, if there are things that you've heard, particularly from PWC and Roland Berger, and you want to be able to contribute to their thinking before their final reports are published, please do get in touch and we can make that happen. In the meantime, Robert, Carrie, Rachael, Shama, thank you very much for your time.